Good evening and welcome to Moyo the Heart Center, where we offer transformational talks, interviews, webinars, podcasts for open-hearted people searching for inspirational truth to heal themselves, their families, their communities, and ultimately the world. In honor of Human Rights Month in South Africa, we have dedicated a 5-session series of podcasts to spirit-led conversations. Tonight is session 4. I can't believe it. It will be our last evening next Tuesday at 7 p.m., the 30th of March. Tonight we will look at the heart chakra and the throat. I'm excited to learn more about how these chakras will support our spirit-led conversations. It is with an open heart that I welcome our two guides for this series, Dr. Makati Mokoena and Ilse Ockles, with much gratitude.
Thank you, Cindy. And welcome, everybody. It is always so humbling to have all of you join us on our journey. To get us going, to start us off, we are going to do an invocation. And I will ask that if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes and perhaps bring your hand, your left hand, over your heart area and your right hand to cover your left hand. And take some deep breaths there. And allow yourself to connect with your heart. Maybe you can feel your heartbeat. Maybe you can't. That's okay. It's still beating. And as you take deep breaths in and out, allow yourself to imagine, no, not to imagine, to call the female guide, the feminine guide that walks with you. Who is the feminine guide that walks with you? And invite them to step forward and stand to your left. And feel their energy. Even if you don't feel their energy, trust that they have stepped forward. And allow yourself to bask in their presence. And as you take some deep breaths in, call forth the masculine that walks with you. And you may know him, maybe not, but trust that he knows you and that he has stepped forward right now and is standing to your right. And feel his energy, feel his holding as you rest between the feminine and the masculine, the two that walk with you always. And so we ask you, the great goddess and the great God, the feminine and the masculine, to please be with us tonight. We call on you to shine your light on our path. Oh. We know that you know the hardships that we endure here on earth in these bodies. We know that you know how hard it is for us to trust our hearts, to open our hearts to one another. Please help us to trust in love, even if we do not know it in its fullness. Please help us to welcome one another even when our hearts do not want to. Help us to welcome one another, even when our hearts are afraid. Help us to welcome one another so that we may give each other what we have for each other. And let us use all this energy, all this love that we're giving to one another. Let us use it also to welcome ourselves, to meet ourselves, to open our hearts to ourselves, to love ourselves, and perhaps also to forgive ourselves our mistakes. We know that the heart is the center where love resides, where love can be expressed, where love can land. And as we go in this evening's journey, this evening's conversation with one another, may we trust one another and open up so that we can hear what we have not heard before, understand what we refuse to understand, and perhaps love even when we think that we do not deserve that love. We thank you. We thank you. We thank you, and we invite you, please stay. Let's take a couple more deep breaths. As you feel your heart opening up and trusting in its opening. And take a deep breath one more time. And as you exhale, send love, send light to everybody that's in the room with us this evening. And you can open your eyes. And good evening. Ilse?
Good evening. Thank you, Makati. I told you a bit earlier how I'm transfixed on that candle burning in that lotus flower next to you. And to me, it represents that open, that beautiful open heart, and your beautiful open heart. Strong heart, a strong, resilient, open heart. So thank you for starting us off this evening so beautifully. Yes, so welcome everybody. From me, a reminder again, just about this principle of contracting. Not contracting as in closing down, but contracting as in boundaries, as in agreements. And that's actually beautiful. If I think about it, we're going to be talking about agreements and certain contracts and vows when we get to also to the throat chakra. And of course, a conversation comes out of the throat chakra. So there's a way in which the throat chakra has governed actually this entire series of conversations, now that I think about it. But yeah, so just a reminder for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, we spent our entire first session talking about contracting and how important it is, the spirit with which we enter into these conversations, and how excited Makati and I were when we were approached by Cindy that we could have these conversations spirit-led, that we could have them within a spiritual container, because so often these conversations happen in a place that can be very harsh and that can feel very unsafe. So we clarified our intentions at the beginning. Those intentions have held us and guided us. And we've acknowledged the spiritual container within which we would like to have these conversations. And I think the last thing I just want to say about that is that as somebody who grew up white, who's racialized white, it's very important for me every time to acknowledge that this is a gift, to be able to have this conversation. Because when we start talking about race, we immediately activate a pain body, a collective, often unconscious pain body. And that pain body is experienced differently if you have been racialized black, if you have grown up black, than if you have been racialized white and grown up white. So very often these conversations about race come at a far greater cost to the black person in the conversation than the white person. And so I want to acknowledge that. And I want to also acknowledge in that spirit of gifting, that this conversation is a gift. That is how one then treats it, with such reverence and with such gratitude for that generosity. I think those are, I love those words actually, reverence and gratitude. And then I also just wanted to pick up, Makgati, while I'm speaking, about the fact that we've had our Human Rights Week. Last week we spoke about the fact that we were in the middle of Human Rights Week, and that culminated with Human Rights Day. So just to acknowledge that, one of the important markers of this conversation series that we've had. And I wanted to just share one of the things that I read that really touched me. It's just linking to this question of the contracting. Was an interview that was done with one of the survivors of the Sharpeville massacre. His name is Mr. Abraham Mofa King, and I wanted to acknowledge him this evening. He's 82 years old. He is 82 years old. He was 21 when he survived the Sharpeville massacre, and he was shot himself. So he did survive the massacre. He was shot. And when they interviewed him, and this is now 60 years later, 60 years later, what he said to the Sunday, I think it was the Sunday Independent, he says, we are so tired of telling our stories. We are so tired of telling our stories. We have been waiting for 60 years for change to come to Sharpeville. And I just thought how often we think about Nelson Mandela and his 27 years. This is a whole nother story. This is a level up. 60 years. And still, Makgati, such a graciousness, such a generosity of spirit after 60 years. And I think that is what I wanted to start us off with this evening, because we want to enter into our conversation around this idea of the heart chakra. And my first question to Makgati around the heart chakra was about this ability for forgiveness, this capacity of forgiveness, and where that comes from and what that is about. But you might, Makgati, you might have one or two other things you want to share before we dive into the substance of that conversation.
Well, it's a reflection on our homework. That horrible phrase, homework. But a reflection process, a reflection practice to tie us over from week to week. And what we had left you with, what we had asked you, was the question, who do I find difficult to love? And this brought us immediately, it's bringing us into today's session, and also to reflect on, or rather an invitation to perform one act of challenging racism, one real act of challenging racism. And I can reflect on my one act of challenging racism, which is in some of the work that I do. I find myself constantly challenging racism, but particularly now in the work that I do, in one of the sessions, I found myself really confronting and challenging and correcting somebody about their misperceptions. I think in the past, I wouldn't have been that blunt about the challenge, but I found myself doing it as honestly and without apology. But also, it wasn't an attack. It was done in a way that he could receive it, and he received it. And I was greatly humbled by his ability to receive the correction without defending against it. And I think that speaks beautifully of the openness of this lotus that is sitting here right next to me. Did you have anything that you'd like to share of your homework? Were you able to experience anything, do anything?
So the thing that I've been working with really, Mahati, since the beginning of this process, since the beginning of this conversation, one of the things that was revealed to me was how much I have internalized some kind of judgment around around my fellow white people. And I didn't realize how pronounced it was. And one of the things that was so interesting was, you know, when you spoke about the divinity, at some point you spoke about the divinity. And I realized that how difficult it was. I think I shared it in that session as well, how difficult it was for me to actually access divinity through whiteness. And so I've been working with that. And so I've been working very much with that, you know, who do you find difficult to love? Who do you find difficult to love? And it's interesting because I think that the whole, I think there's a lot of shadow work that I need to do there still. It's, you know, there's a kind of a projection of righteousness that happens onto Black people. And then a kind of a shadow, a carrying of a certain shadow around white people. And so there's some interesting work, some interesting things that is being stirred up for me on this journey. And I think that'll also, oh, I've got a very itchy nose. What does that mean? What's the symbolism of an itchy nose?
You're going to fight with somebody.
I'm going to fight with somebody.
Be me.
Not you. But it also reminds, it also brings up this idea that this thing that I'm so keen to talk about. I don't know why I'm so keen to talk about it, but this thing of this bystander syndrome, you know, this thing that helped me understand a lot of white behaviors. And so, yeah, so there's a connection there.
Yeah. So earlier on, thanks, Ilza. You asked, you posed the question, why Black people find it so easy to forgive, something like that. And I have to say that the first time I heard that, something went inside of me. But then when I was reading about the heart chakra, Anahata, in Sanskrit, it means unbeaten, unhurt, which is interesting. And I think it speaks of the strength of love, the power of the heart. And it's not, I haven't really thought of the heart as a powerful, the heart center as a powerful center, which means that I haven't thought of love as powerful, because that's what it means, is that love is powerful. And so your question about how is it that Black people find it so easy to forgive? So immediately it brings me to the holding of binaries. where there is one that is experiencing the hurt and there is one that is causing the hurt. And it feels to me that once I enter into that space, then I perpetually will be a victim, and whiteness will be perpetually the perpetrator. That is not to say that that may not be the experience. In fact, often that is the experience. However, for me, what is equally essential is recognizing that even in the perpetration, because my task here on earth is about finding freedom from all the stories that will tell me who I am, that when I step into holding hurt, then I am automatically going against the power of love and the power of the heart. Not only that, then I also cement myself, I contract myself. Now, this is the usage of the contract. I lock myself into a particular situation, into a location that I can never get out of. Because that's what happens when you are unable to forgive. That's what happens when I hold on to hurt and I do not give myself opportunity to express the hurt or to challenge, express the hurt, challenge the cause of the hurt. And also finally, give myself that gift of reframing my experience of the hurt, because I know that having come onto this earth, I have come to experience the immensity of what it means to be human. And some of those experiences are beautiful and radiant and just absolutely astonishing in their magnificence. Astonishing. And more of those experiences, however, are devastating and are difficult to stomach. And so what I am teaching myself right now is how to make space for all of them. And not only move towards that which is beautiful and affirming and life-giving, whilst rejecting that which takes away, but rather welcoming all of them and seeing, how do I grow? Am I able to grow through each of those experiences? And so how am I as a Black person able to forgive? The forgiveness is a gift to me. First of all, it's a gift to me, and it is a gift, and this may sound very trite, but it is a gift that says, Makati, what is your capacity? It is easy for me to hold on to hurt, and I know I do, to hold on to disappointment, to hold on to betrayal, to hold on to experiences that are painful to me. It's easy for me to hold on to my suffering and to point at all the experiences that are responsible for my suffering. But I also know that there is no power in that. For me, there is no power in that. For me, my task is, how do I have a look again and see that life on earth is about suffering. And in order for me to grow, what I'm called to do is transmute that suffering. Because when I hold it and I'm unable to forgive it, it only grows and grows and grows, and it swallows me up. And I will most likely come back to the next lifetime and to the next lifetime, continually perpetrating this suffering inside of me, which means that the energy I put out into the world is also one that is dense, because suffering is dense. It doesn't allow for my growth. So, so I forgive as an expression of love for me. And it's the love that I never knew I deserved. It's the love that I never knew was available. But it's the love that I am teaching myself to bring into the world, regardless of what is happening in the world. Even when I want to close my heart against the world. Even when closing my heart is the only response. Seems to be the only response. I am teaching myself to open my heart and to keep it open. That's why I'm teaching myself to forgive.
Thank you. Is there anything that you need right now? Is there anything we can offer you in return for this beautiful gift?
This is why we are here on earth, to serve one another. This is why we are here. Is there anything I need? I can breathe through this and keep my heart open. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. Sure, that was beautiful, Makati. And I think that, you know, you were talking, you invoked the feminine and the masculine. And so in a way, we're playing with these binaries in a way. And in a way, what you've just offered us is this embodied, lived, sacred moment of living open-heartedly. And there is a power to that. I think all of us felt, I think everybody on this call, I think felt the power of that. And the kind of the other side of that is what happens when we live with our hearts shut down. And I think in my experience, you know, one of the things that Black people often say is, you know, what is it with white people? How can they be so unfeeling? How can they be so close-hearted? You know, how can they? And of course, in a way that in a way, it's a form of dehumanization, and we've spoken about that term before. When your own heart shuts down, you become less of yourself, of your own self. And the way you then, the force, the energy that you bring in the world then often dehumanizes those around you. So it is the inverse of that power, of that power of love. It's the inverse of that. And I must say, I really struggled with that. I really struggled with that, to the point where I had to ask, even as a young child, I had to ask myself, how is it possible? Are white people inherently evil? Are they inherently defective? Is there, it was really something that I really grappled with. And the one thing that has helped me kind of wrestle with this thing, was the work that came out of the Holocaust. And for some reason, the Holocaust is very present with me tonight. It's very present tonight. And we want to end this evening also with a poem from a Holocaust survivor. And also, of course, when we move up to the throat chakra. But for now, we're in the heart still. And some of the research that came out of the Holocaust was on this phenomenon called the bystander syndrome. All those people in and around the concentration camps during the Holocaust, who knew what was happening to a greater or lesser extent, knew what was happening, and who felt powerless to intervene. Of course, we know the amazing stories of people who did step up, who did intervene, who did act from a place of love, and at their own, obviously at incredible risk to themselves. But the absolute overwhelming majority of people were bystanders to these atrocities. And the two psychologists in particular that worked with this, and for those who are interested to go and look it up, Mary Watkins and Helene Schulman, and the book that my colleague Rejean Williams introduced to me, Towards Psychologies of Liberation, and how they explain the behaviors associated with this syndrome was the first time that it felt to me like a key that could unlock some understanding of how many white people are able to live as bystanders on a daily basis to what's going on around us. And some of the syndrome, some of the phenomena of the syndrome we've spoken about before. Remember, we spoke about this idea of the empty self before. So this idea of an empty self, I'm just going to read them here so that I don't get them wrong, but they call it the psychic wounds of bystanding. That's what they call it. A severing of self, a preoccupation with your personal survival and success. Your personal survival and success. So a complete disconnect. That whole principle of Ubuntu just is, has been completely obliterated. Loneliness. I mean, how many white people do we know that suffer from profound loneliness? Narcissism. Greed, and then what they refer to as psychic numbing. And then the last one that I also find so interesting, they refer to it as an obsessive compulsive rehearsal of violence. And the reason for that, the way I understood what they offered by way of understanding, is that because you were a bystander to this extreme violence and didn't act on it, there is a way in which your psyche wants to process that and work with that. And so it becomes this obsessive compulsive rehearsal of violence, this obsession with crime, even when we know that white people are absolutely disproportionately protected from crime compared to Black people. But still this obsession with violence. And so some of these things, I must say, learning about these things helped me to begin to kind of try and understand the phenomenon of bystanding, whiteness better. And yeah, I thought that I would like to offer that in this evening because it's not something that many of us are familiar with. And yet we often see ourselves displaying those behaviors. And the way out, so we have to have the way out. The way out, according to these authors, is what they call from bystander to what they call being an engaged witness. An engaged witness. So not just a voyeur, not just, somebody that sees. It's not just not turning away. It's not just looking, but it is becoming engaged and being a witness to what is happening. So it's an active stance that's being asked of us. And I know you wanted to say something about this concept of witness.
Yeah. Whew. I mean, when you were saying all the, you were reading what we see with bystander, what is it? The bystander phenomenon, that I was asking myself, what do we do with that? What do I do with that? I mean, here we are at the heart center, which is about the interlocking. It's about the bridging. It's that space where the south is finding the north, and the north is finding the south, and meeting here in the center. And so what do we do when we encounter a cut-offness and an inability or an unwillingness to engage in a real manner where real healing can take place and real transformation? Because also that's the power of the heart as well. It's about transforming the self and transforming relationships. And so you offering that engaged witnessing reminded me very much of a phrase that I coined, which is witnessing. Witnessing. So it isn't a passive voyeurism of just looking with curiosity and perhaps with some kind of macabre delight. But when we witness, we recognize that we are part of whatever is happening there, even though it may not appear to be happening to us, but we are part of it because we are interlocked in relationships with one another. This is the point. This is why we have come to earth, is to figure out how do we transform these relationships so that eventually all of us don't have to come back. None of us ever has to come back to this earth school, but that we really learn the lessons that we have agreed to learn and make the contributions that we have agreed to make through the bodies that we have chosen at the moment of incarnation. And so this witnessing, for me, constantly reminds me that Makgati, you may be looking at a reality that seemingly is happening around you. Absolutely. But remember that we are connected. The interdependence is absolutely real. But also there are some radical spiritual teachings that remind us that there is nobody in the world but yourself. So earlier on when I said what forgiveness does is to free me, even as I seemingly offer forgiveness outside of myself to somebody out there, actually I'm giving it to myself. So it's a very selfish act of self-release. Because when I am freed, it means that you are free. When you are freed, it means that I am free. And it's a path that I continually have to wake myself up to, because it is easy to step into the dynamic of holding the binaries and forgetting that we are joined, irrevocably joined. And we didn't come here to sustain the divisions. We have come here to find these bridges back to one another. Because perhaps that is our journey back to divinity, with one another.
Beautiful. That is so beautiful. And I can actually feel, I have a sensation actually of this conversation moving up to the throat now. I can just actually, actually feel it. And I do love the throat chakra. I do love that throat chakra. Obviously because I love talking quite a lot. But there's something very powerful, very, very powerful about the throat chakra. And we've spoken about contracting, and we've spoken about agreements, and we've spoken about being in conversation. But there are also some other interesting elements. We've also spoken about we've spoken about choice to some degree, but I was interested to see that this idea of choice sits so strongly with the throat chakra. And there are a couple of other things about the throat chakra that I really love, but I want to ask you to sort of start us off, what it means for you, what comes up for you in terms of your journey. You're a speaker, you're a facilitator, you're a ceremony, you're an accompanier. I mean, the voice is very large in your life and in your destiny.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've regarded myself as a teacher and a healer, and that my teaching actually is a form of healing. And of course, I need my voice for that work. And yet I know that it is impossible to teach what I have not lived. And so my teaching, my use of the voice, first and foremost, is in service of me. It is, whatever it is that I am teaching, I ask myself, Makati, where does it land inside of you? How does it sit inside of you? And what change is it assisting to facilitate inside of you, inside of me? And so when I ask these questions, I have to be reminded that it's about constantly choosing to step within the power of my own voice. Even though the Black body is not a body that often gets listened to because we do not have authority to speak, we will get overlooked. Who is the white person? Who is the madam in charge? And that's the person that gets asked for. And I know that that shows up in varying forms in the spaces that I have occupied. And I know that I have caused many problems. I used to be a teacher of psychology at a university. And I know that in speaking up against the injustices that I saw being done against Black students, the lack of preparatory space for Black students thriving that my challenging them in a predominantly Afrikaans university, that when I spoke up, I got into trouble. And there were a couple of us, I think 3 only Black students or Black lecturers of color. And we were seen as the problem. We were termed the problem group or something like that. And that's what happens, is the minute there's a sense of, I'm going to do something about creating a safe landing space for Black students in this particular environment, because I can see that these Black students have to be taught in Afrikaans, or if they're not taught in Afrikaans, certainly the kind of assessment that is done isn't taking into consideration that these are not first language users. So let me explain. Because this was a predominantly Afrikaans university, the Afrikaans students were being taught in Afrikaans. They were taking assessments and examinations in Afrikaans, which means that they thrived. They could do well in their tests. However, when we came to Black students, English was maybe a 3rd language, a 4th language, and yet the way the teaching was happening in English, which means that the Black students had to do extra work in order to catch up. Now, people don't often think about this. When you are a first language user, you take it for granted. You take that piece for granted. But for somebody who isn't a first language user, they have to work the extra hard. So Black students had to work extra hard, and in order to catch up with the teaching, and also to understand, what is it that I'm being examined on here? Is it an examination of language proficiency, or is it an examination of my knowledge? And often it would be an examination of language proficiency. And of course, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Look how these Black students, you see, we've welcomed these Black people, now they're not, you see. And so we spoke up. We spoke up and we asked, we insisted on creating some assistance for Black students so that they too would have a chance to thrive. And that's the thing. When you speak up, sometimes you get into trouble, but you know, what the fuck, I don't care. It's about beyond the me, I don't care, but it's also about highlighting to people who are not aware that your success is coming to you because of a built-in enabling instance. It's built in because all this education is happening in your own mother tongue. You don't have to work that hard. So don't ever think that Blackness is equated, it should be equated with ignorance or with not knowing. Also, because when that happens, what we have tended to do, and I'm taking another direction now, what we have tended to do then is to doubt that which is related to Blackness and that which is related to Africanness. And so we've lost out on ancient wisdoms. We have lost out on the teachings of our ancestors who knew how to relate to the earth, who knew how to live in cycle with nature. What we have done instead is to find a way of taking away from one another and taking away from nature, treating one another as commodities and treating nature as a commodity from which we can extract for lining our own pockets, forgetting that that's not the purpose for why we have come to this earth. The purpose is much bigger than that. And so the speaking up is necessary, hopefully, because eventually it will get us back to what we have lost, what we have belittled, what we have stepped on of our First Nations and the traditional wisdoms that that we've all forgotten. Yeah. And I know that you have something to share about the Cassandra complex. You know, who gets listened to? That's the question for me. How is it that we have positioned white people to be the authority on everything? I imagine it's a burden, surely. And what do you do with that?
Yeah, so we spoke when we did our kind of prep conversation, I raised this thing about the Cassandra, this phenomenon of Cassandra, and also that beautiful story about the emperor with no clothes on. You know, who does it take to speak up? So Cassandra from the Greek mythology, who had the gift of speech, the gift of prophecy, but because she refused Apollo or somebody's advances, she got cursed that, you know, she would have this gift, but people would not hear her, would not listen to her. And then I also shared with you that for some of the work that I do, I love working with African proverbs because they're such profound teaching, learning tools. And about the one that we always use, you know, the one who speaks truth gets chased out of 10 villages. You know, you'll get chased out of 10 villages, the one who speaks the truth. So this idea of speaking up is very close to my heart. Did you see what we did there? Speaking up, close to my heart chakra, throat chakra. It's close to each other. These things are very profoundly connected. And when we don't speak up, when we have to speak up, it actually impacts our other energy centers. And we actually get out of misalignment. And so much harm is done by omission, isn't it? I mean, there's that famous statement by, I don't know, Edmund Burke or something, you know, for evil to thrive, all that has to happen is for good people to sort of do nothing, to say nothing and to do nothing. So there's this thing about speaking out. One of my most kind of favorite stories to think about is when it comes to the throat chakra. And I actually shared this with my beloved book club friends on the weekend, and I couldn't remember the name of the author, and I confess I haven't gone to research it. But there's this fancy Franschhoek literary festival that happens most years, and a couple of years ago there was a black author. You know, it's very much a white affair. It used to be a very white affair, and a couple of years ago there was one black author that actually just said out loud to everybody, people, this is unnatural. Look around you. This is unnatural. How did it get to be like this? And it's that outrage, you know, it's that little child that says, but the emperor is naked. You know, it's that kind of outrage that that somehow, you know, it's a truth, and and we also know the power of truth. You know, we know the power of the heart, but we also know the power of truth to set us free. And in my experience, white people don't speak out. They don't speak up. They don't speak out. They don't call out their fellow whites. And it's got something to do with breaking ranks. You know, it's got something to do with those family ties, with those cultural ties. So you might actually be doing a violence to yourself by enduring all this racist talk around the braai or around the, you know, Friday evening table, or, you know, wherever you gather, by not speaking out. Yeah, so that's the one aspect of it. But the other aspect of it, Mahati, is when we were thinking about this evening's conversation, you asked, you know, something that was so powerful. I have to read it. It was so perfect. She says, and white people give themselves permission listen to this little list: to give orders, to correct, to find fault, and to take over. I love it. To give orders, to correct, to find fault, and to take over. And to do all of that in a certain tone, that tone of the madam, that tone of internalized dominance, like an unconscious sort of entitled kind of tone. So that's sort of the other side, really, of what comes up for me when I'm thinking about the throat chakra, and when I'm thinking about being the experience of whiteness in relation to the throat chakra. But the other thing that I think is interesting about the throat chakra is that it's also, according to Caroline Myss, every week I go back and read a little bit of Caroline Myss and her book, Sacred Contract. And she says it's also the place of confession and the place of soul retrieval. And so when we come to our homework for the week ahead, we connected in with this idea of confession, this idea of what do I need to confess, what do I need to speak out loud, and how can I, call parts of my soul back around that. And of course, there's also giving your word. There's making a vow. Are we ready? And we're not asking anybody to make vows, but we're just tentatively putting it out there. Are we ready? What kind of vows do we want to make as we kind of go forward? And the very last thing I want to say, and we've got only a few more minutes left, is that for me, as somebody trained as a lawyer, the Constitution, also the beloved Constitution of our country, also vests. It's a law. And it also vests partly in the throat chakra, partly in the third eye, which we're going to talk about next week. But I also want to encourage everybody to go and read the preamble to the Constitution this week. The preamble to the Constitution, because it starts by saying, we the people, and it's a declaration. It belongs with the throat chakra. It's a declaration. And our Constitution, I think, is something worth defending, worth speaking out for. So the last few minutes, back to you, Makgati.
Oh, I feel the pressure. I feel the heat. No, but the last few minutes, and then we'll listen to your piece, the Bertolt Brecht piece. But I wanted to say that that perhaps the work for us is different. That the work, and I think this is something that we spoke of as well, that the work for white people who may tend to be inward and be doing the inner work and getting lost inside, that perhaps the work is lift your head up, have a look around you. What is it? Where is it that you can start creating change and getting involved in some work around transforming your environment? Because you have so much power that has been put upon you, that it is imperative that you use that power for the good of all. And perhaps the work for us as Black people who are out here constantly fighting to shift and change our physical environment, because it's an environment that does not welcome us, that does not make space for us, that we say, well, let's actually go in here and go and connect with that inner power that resides inside of us and do that inner work of not waiting for white people to approve of us, not waiting for white people to create, to act with justice, not wait for white people to create the structures and to share power and to share privilege and to share wealth and to stop extracting and to stop. We're not waiting. So we are going within and we are connecting with that fierce power of the heart, so that when we go out there and we speak, it is with that utter conviction that can move situations that can move mountains in the most perplexing way. And I think that when we show up, I know that when we show up like that, we become forces that absolutely must be reckoned with. But we have to start from here, from inside there, and then we go out there. For white people, you start from out there and you start from in here and you go out. And you say, oh, hang on a bit. What's happening in this environment of mine? What have I contributed? What have I taken when I should have contributed?
So we're coming to the end of our hour, and so we wanted to finish off this evening in the spirit of the throat chakra, and also honoring the lessons that have come before us. And actually, Mahati, it actually isn't Bertolt Brecht. You were right, because you said, why didn't you recognize it? It's a Lutheran, it is a German Lutheran pastor called Martin Niemöller. Niemöller.
Yeah.
And it's called First They Came. And it's a very famous confessional poem. And I also encourage those who might have sparked for you this evening to go and Google this piece, First They Came, by Martin Niemöller. Just go and look at Wikipedia, because there's just such an interesting sort of backstory also to it, in terms of his own life. But it goes like this: First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. So our homework, do you want to give a quick recap of our homework?
Homework, witness and witness. Notice where you are witnessing, and notice when you are witnessing in your own life. What is it? What is the energy that you bring to experiences that you notice around you? Is it a witnessing one, or is it a witnessing one? And what happens inside of you when you step into witnessing instead of only witnessing without engaging?
And if I can add to that, in the spirit of the throat chakra,
yes,
what do you need to do? What is coming up for you? Which aspect of the throat chakra do you want to attend to in this week? Is it something that you need to confess? Is it part of your soul that you need to retrieve, where you've been out of alignment? Is it a vow that you need to think about making? Is it speaking out, where you might have been silent in the past? Which aspect of the throat chakra, which choices might you need to be making at this point to bring you into greater alignment with the forces of your heart, with your own value system sitting in your solar plexus, and with that other difficult work that we did around our sacral and our root chakras? Yeah.
Wow. Ladies, thank you very much. That was, I think we're all a little bit stunned with questions. I think it was thank you so much for sharing with such openness and with your hearts really open and speaking. I have a question before, and then we have another question from one of our participants. My question is around forgiveness, and Makati, you spoke about the forgiveness, and I'm wondering, as a white privileged person, is there's guilt and shame for me in my heart, um, around my ancestors, around my witnessing in terms of keeping quiet quite often. Not always, but there are times when we keep quiet. Would one need to forgive oneself before one entered into looking? Because if I can't get rid of my shame for myself, how am I going to meet you as an equal? And my question is that maybe where I need to start, and forgiveness for the ancestors within my own heart, so that I don't meet you as the perpetrator?
Sure. Whew. Several points. I see guilt as a as an emotion, as a state that keeps us stuck, and in itself it can hold us so much in a position that we continue to self-flagellate and never get out of it. Guilt can be so intense, but it can be so intense in serving the maintaining of the status quo. That's my experience of guilt, because we continue to feel so bad, but it doesn't necessarily catalyze action. It keeps us locked in a position, and guilt and shame do the same thing. Shame, what it does, it says, oh, you think you can do, you think you can act, you think you can forgive, you think you can create change, but look how paltry, look how this is so small. What you have done actually doesn't even amount to anything. And so when you get stuck in the shame of feeling ineffective. And so for me, I feel that ability to look into yourself and be real in really examining what's happening inside of me, and which aspects do I need to let go of, because they are only imprisoning me further, and the more I am imprisoned, the more I imprison others that I interact with. And so, do I give myself permission to let go, to open up and to let go of all of those aspects that would have me imprisoned? And that also includes which parts of my ancestral story am I using to keep myself in guilt? And so the ancestral story is one that we also welcome. Yes, this is also part of. This is part of what's happened. Absolutely. I too am part of that. It runs inside of my blood. I recognize that it is part of me. And the most reverent thing to do with that is by first acknowledging it and forgiving those that have come before us. And how do we forgive? Is by what is the behavior that I engage in today? What is the thought pattern that I engage in today? And taking responsibility for my impact today. When I do that, then I start healing my ancestral lineage, those people that didn't do the work. Because perhaps you have come here to release them. And as you release them, we release one another.
Thank you.
Cindy, may I add?
Yes, please.
May I add, just on the shame? I think that for me, there's something very different between shaming somebody. You know, that I think is absolutely I wanted to say unforgivable, but now we've just been talking about forgiveness for the whole evening. But I think that is really, that is a real profound harm that we do when we shame people. And so shaming has also indigenous roots in terms of, when you shame people and in a restorative justice type framework, and people have to leave the village, so that some healing can come. I think what I want to say is I think that there is a productive element of shame. In the same way that I think that sometimes somebody has to be, people have to be moved to the periphery in some way to confront something. I also think that to feel ashamed for me is slightly different. I don't know if I'm just sort of splitting hairs, I think is the English expression. But to feel ashamed to me is the beginnings, it's a stirring of conscience. It is a pathway to somewhere else. I think very often to feel ashamed is the absolute appropriate feeling in a certain context. And I think that we then need to own that feeling of shame, of feeling ashamed. There is a beautiful Mary Oliver poem, I wish I knew it, where she speaks about, and I think it has to do with the degradation of Mother Earth, and where she says, I don't go a day or whatever without falling to the ground, ashamed, ashamed, ashamed. She says it 3 times. And I think that in the same way that I suggested in our very first session, that when we start doing this work, we, particularly white people, have to start from a place of grief. I feel that shame, feeling ashamed, is somehow connected also to that place of grief. And I don't want us to push that away. I want us to work with, I want to invite us all to work, to make that a noble thing, to make feeling ashamed noble, so that it can take us to where we need to go, so that it can liberate us, and so that it can open our hearts, and it can help us heal the solar plexus. It can help us, it can help bring us, it can help us on that path. I just wanted to add that.
Ilse, I meant ashamed, as opposed to the shame, shaming someone. It was that feeling of yesterday driving at the back of Kailicha and having a look at what people were protesting for today. And I felt ashamed because I am that. I am part of how that was built. And I think when you start feeling that in your heart and going, I am that, because I contribute by living, just by that history, I am that. And I think that is where that emotion, to put it into context for our listeners and for yourselves, is where I felt ashamed.
And that's a true,
that.
and in my sort of humble opinion, that is an appropriate response. That is a true and correct response. Not to get stuck there, not, as Makati said, for it to paralyze us and for us to get into a state of overwhelm, and so that the status quo, so that we remain stuck in inaction around it. But there is something about the human spirit that cannot witness that and not feel a complex set of emotions, of which shame needs to be part. That's my sense of it.
Thank you. I have another question. So from one of our listeners, thank you all for creating this discussion forum with so much vulnerability and openness. As a white person, I recognize the discrimination against persons with a black stroke colored body in the past and present. I also recognize the discrimination against people with a female body or a disabled body or a young body or of a poor background or of a political conviction or uneducated. My experience is a complex matter, and I find myself twisted and contoured in trying to keep all potential types of discrimination in mind when communicating with a person. Is there not an underlying problem that binds all these forms of discrimination together, or is race discrimination fundamentally different from other forms of discrimination?
I will offer my own thinking. And my thinking is that what we humans are doing and have done for eons is we have stepped away our from our true nature as spirit bodies, as connected to source. We have forgotten who we are. And in the forgetting who we are, we then try to patch up in some way who we are and find and are trying to find a source of who we are from spaces that do not actually serve the making up of who we are or the clarifying of who we really are. And in that, we have created all these divisions amongst one another. Because we feel the fundamental disconnect from source, it's almost as if then we disconnect from everything else. We disconnect from one another, we disconnect from nature, so our relating to all there is preceded by disconnection. And once disconnection happens, then it is easy, or it enables the perpetration of all sorts of violence against one another. And then we justify it. We then say maleness is better or more valued, whiteness is more valued. So we imbue all sorts of value into really very randomly into these divisions, into the bodies where we see these divisions. But I think fundamentally, our biggest wound is that of disconnection. And I think we struggle to find ways to recreate that disconnect, to recreate a connection and find our way back to one another and our way back to source, to divinity.
Thank you, Makati. Ilse, have you got anything to add to that?
Well, I think that is a question that is worthy of living. You know, Rainer Maria Rilke has that beautiful quote about how there's some questions that we have to live, and we have to sort of live our way into the answer, because it is such a profound question. It's such a meta question. And I think that question is a question worthy of one's life. It certainly is a question that I've been grappling with for a very long time. And the answer, the place that I've gotten to with wrestling with that question, which is nowhere near an answer or a conclusion, but the place that I've gotten to is a real yes-no response. Because on the one hand, there is oppression and discrimination is sort of an indivisible thing, and it's not, wherever we find it, wherever we find that dehumanization, wherever we find that oppression, it is so harmful. And there is something Makati has offered into us, this idea of, of this profound, this disconnection, this profound disconnection, this objectification that we can do with somebody who is the other, the communist, the trade unionist, the disabled person, the gay person, the Black person. So yes, on the one hand, there is this the way in which people's suffering and the othering can be dealt with sort of as this underlying kind of pattern almost, which is part of how I understand the question. And yet, if we come down again to the kind of the lower chakras, and if we look at what the world looks like, and if we look at how the world is structured, and if we look at where wealth is, and if we look at what has value, it is racialized. It is racialized. And particularly in this country, of course, we are dealing with this conversion of race and class. So we have, 90%, 95% of people in this country are Black and are living with, less than 5,000 Rand a month or something. The actual statistics, the structural inequalities are so extreme. And it brings me to this notion of intersectionality, which is another term, it's another fancy term, it's another aspect of the curriculum of our kind of race kind of conversations. If you look at each of those forms of othering, whether you're gay, whether you're disabled, whether it's a linguistic or a religious discrimination, if the Black person, the person who's racialized Black, showing up in that form of otherness, will still have to endure more oppression, will still suffer more than the white person showing up in that form of otherness. And so it is that intersectionality of race with each of these other forms of disadvantage that really create a very compounded, a very complex lived reality for people who then find themselves at that point of multiple intersection. So, and often we stereotype that person, and we make fun of that person because it'll score us 10 points on our employment equity sort of target. So if we can just find, the Black, disabled, lesbian from the rural areas, we're going to score big time on our employment equity profile. But the reality is that those lives lived in those intersections of disadvantage are structurally, it is such an injustice. And so I wouldn't have been able to go to bed tonight if we didn't also acknowledge that race continues to play that kind of very significant role.
Thank you for that very detailed question. Thank you for raising that. I think it brought up some very good discussions. We don't have any more questions from our audience. So I would like to say a very big thank you to Ilse and Makati for sharing that. I think for me, the important thing is I don't want to come back again. So I want to do this work now. And I really want to do it now because, as someone who works hard on their spirituality, this has been a big gap in being at one in my heart. And so thank you for our homework. With so much gratitude, thank you both for being here this evening. And thank you to our participants and our audience. And we look forward to seeing you all next week on Tuesday.